Good morning. Welcome to the second session for our program that we've captioned Redevelopment After Destruction for Tenants and Homeowners. This is a community forum for Florida residents facing hurricane disasters. And as reflected, what we have attempted to do is to make sure that we look at the legal rights available not only to homeowners, but to tenants as well. We trust that you had an opportunity, if you are a homeowner, to hear our last segment. But if you did not, please know that you will have an opportunity because it will be uploaded on the law school's website. For now, in anticipation of moving forward, please take a look at our program. This time, we will focus in on tenants, specifically looking at these three phases of the experience, if you will, that we all have dealing with hurricanes in the great state of Florida. Now, as indicated before, we're not focusing on the statistics and the data. We're focusing on your rights. We want to make sure that as lawyers, we provide you with the essential topics and answers to those issues that arise under those topics. And so from our perspective, this is the least that we can do to try and help our neighbors and friends. So if you are on and know of someone who can benefit, please call them, give them the link, ask them to join us, because at the very end of this segment, we will have a question and answer period so that people can ask questions, recognizing that our speakers cannot provide legal advice. So thank you again for joining us. And we are now going to begin with brief discussion of, shall I say, some information to help us put the significance of this program in context. We're going to begin by talking to attorney, or hearing from, I should say, attorney Dalmacy, who is a staff attorney in the Eviction Defense Unit. She is a lawyer licensed in the District of Columbia. She received her Bachelor of Arts from Hunter College and a master's degree in diplomacy from Seton Hall, and her law degree from Western Michigan University Cooley Law School. Attorney Dalmacy has committed her life to helping people in all aspects of her life, not only in her practice, but also in her additional activities. And so let me take this time to welcome Attorney Dalmacy to provide us, if you will, with the significance of, information that will help us to understand the significance of this program. Again, well beyond statistics. Well, what's the human element? She's here to help share just that. Welcome, Attorney Dalmacy.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having me here. I'm an attorney, a Superstorm Sandy survivor, and a former FEMA contractor. I wanted to be here to be part of this forum to share my story with you. My story is one of overcoming, of resiliency, and of hope. So in 2022, exactly October 29, 2022, the day of my first daughter's birthday, Superstorm Sandy made landfall in New York. At the time, I live in Brooklyn, New York, a few steps from the Coney Island Creek. On the day of the storm, I had no idea there was an evacuation order in effect for my area. I got a call from a family friend telling me, "Did you evacuate yet? An evacuation order has been in effect." I had no clue. I had no idea. I had a 10-month-old at the time and a teenage daughter. We had to hurry up and get out of the house as soon as possible because I kept thinking, oh my God, what if the storm hits? What if we get caught in the storm? What am I going to do? So the first thought that came to mind was to secure a place for us to stay So I quickly made a hotel reservation. The nearest hotel that I could find was in a different state. It was in New Jersey, about an hour and a half away from where we lived. So quickly, instead of panic, we packed what we could, whatever little food we could pack, diapers, you name it. So we did not have time to even think. We're like, let's grab anything we can find. Let's get out of here. We got to move. We got to move quickly. So we did. By the grace of God, we were able to evacuate. We moved. We went to a hotel in Jersey. It's a good thing we had followed the evacuation order that was in effect, because a neighbor 2 doors down from us was not that lucky. She was one of 44 people who lost their lives in the storm. May her soul rest in peace. So while we were in New Jersey, this is a segment where I talk about my resiliency. We hunkered down in a hotel in Jersey, and our daughter, 10 months old, was, we home cook her food. So that means, milk, that kind of stuff, baby food, what was not part of our preparation. We did not have that kind of food for her. So that made it a little bit difficult. When we went out of diapers, we used bed sheets, we used towels, to for our daughter, our baby, to handle her business. So I remember while in the hotel thinking about what are we going to do, how to survive. I was doing my master's in diplomacy at the time, and I had papers coming up due. And I'm like, what am I going to do? I said, let's send an email to my teachers, let them know what situation I'm in. They were very sympathetic. They're like, you can take time off from school, take the semester off, no penalties, nothing. But I'm like, I have a goal. I want to finish on time. So I'm like, I'll get it done. Give me a few days, I'll get it done. So I did. And I was able to graduate 7 months later after being, even though I was homeless at the time, with my kids, did not know what I was going to do next. But by the power of God, I maintained my resiliency. I got it done. But from that time on, fast forward a few weeks later, I had a FEMA contractor come to my house to survey the damages. My house was engulfed in over 5 feet of water. Everything was destroyed on the first floor. So when the FEMA contractor came, at the time I had never been exposed to FEMA. I didn't know, what to expect. So the contractor that came to my home was very sympathetic, listened to me, offered advice as to what to expect, what kind of help I can expect from FEMA. He was extremely informative. And that day I made up my mind. I said, I will be a FEMA contractor as well, to help people that are similarly situated. Fast forward a few months later, I became a FEMA contractor. A few years later, I was deployed to New Orleans, and the same help that that FEMA contractor provided to me, I was able to provide that to the people of New Orleans, but with a different twist. I'm a survivor of a superstorm, so I know what they were going through. So when I walk into somebody's home, not only they have hope that FEMA will be coming through once the house is inspected, it's only a matter of time before they get some kind of help from FEMA if they qualify. So when I come there sharing my story with them, letting them know that you will rebuild better, bigger, and better. So even though they're in that midst of a destruction, not knowing when that they're going to get out of the situation, but my story inspires them to give them hope. So that's my story as a FEMA contractor. Fast forward a few years later, I'm a new attorney, freshly graduated from law school, and I got a call while I'm in Florida to be deployed to New York. And I'm like, God, you must be testing me. Few days, 2 days after law school graduation, I'm being deployed. And I answered the call. I said yes, because I remember the promise that I made when that FEMA contractor came to my home. I'm going to be there for other victims. I will provide them hope. I will bring them to share my story with them and also give them hope. So that's what I did. I deployed to New York, and thank God I did, because one of the person I met, my first house that I went to inspect is an 84-year-old man whose wife was terminally ill. She was dying of cancer. His home is destroyed. He's 84. He's lost, and he's crying in my arms. I feel like, committing. I feel like I want to be done with everything. He was thinking of suicide. And thank God I was there. I had answered that call. I could relate to him, tell him my story, letting him know there is hope. your tomorrow will be brighter and better than this moment that you're going through right now. So I am hoping that story resonated with him, that I gave him some kind of hope to let him know you could be in the middle of the storm, but your tomorrow will be better and brighter than ever before. So with that, this is my story that I wanted to share with you. We will continue with the program. So with that, we're going to our next speaker, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Attorney Dalmacy. It's very important for us to make sure that our audience understands the human element of this. And of course, because of the substantive information that we're sharing, it's also important for us to show how much we care by providing them with this information. And so I thank you, and now want to prepare to go to the first topic, because again, we're going to be looking at this hurricane issue from three different perspectives: what to do before, what to do during, and what to do after. And again, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time, but we want to make sure that we zero in on the key things that you need to know. And if necessary, we might have to do another session. But for now, please join me in welcoming Attorney Jason Fletcher. He is the managing partner of Fletcher Legal Group and is an experienced litigation attorney licensed in the state of Florida. He's absolutely dedicated to helping his clients and indeed to contributing here. Mr. Fletcher is particularly interesting because he is a former Associate General Counsel of one of Florida's largest property and casualty insurance companies. So this is a rare opportunity to hear from someone who's actually worked for the very companies that we might ultimately have to contend with. As a result, he's handled hundreds of disputes and will be able to bring that information to our attention. He earned his Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration from the University of Florida. He has an MBA and a Juris Doctor law degree from Stetson University. Welcome, Attorney Fletcher, and thank you so much for your contribution.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm excited to get into this topic. And thank you so much, Attorney Dalmacy, for your story. Absolutely inspiring. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the steps that you can take to protect yourself as a renter. And I think it's important to understand, what rights you have within that relationship. So as a renter, just to be clear, you're not an owner of the property in and of itself. And what ties you to the property is the fact that you have a lease with a landlord who themselves either own it as an individual or they own it as a landlord, say, for example, company. But as a renter, you are going to have property within either a unit or a home that you're renting from a landlord. And the question becomes, how do you protect that property, especially in the wake of a disaster and storms and things of that nature? And the one thing that I always say to everyone is preparation is always going to be key. And one of the great ways to prepare in terms of protecting your personal property is to get renter's insurance. So many landlords actually even require their renters to actually get renter's insurance. But it is a integral part in terms of really you taking the first steps in terms of protecting your personal property. And renter's insurance comes in two different flavors, right? So there is ACV and is also RCV. And just to be able to define that is this. ACV is actual cash value of the items that are being insured. RCV is the replacement cost value of the items that are being insured. And as a renter, your renter's insurance is really going to cover a lot of your contents. It's going to cover your furniture, your clothing. It's going to cover any fixtures that aren't actually attached to the property. So not things like ceiling fans and hanging chandeliers, but it would cover things that, say, for example, you have a television that's attached to the wall. That's actually your own personal property. Things like that would be covered under your renter's insurance policy. And I think it's important to point out actual cost value versus replacement cost value, because What sometimes happens is people think that I'm going to get the money from the insurance company. It's going to be enough for me to get ahead and buy a brand new television, say, for example. Well, if you have an actual cost value policy, what happens in those situations is the insurance company will pay on what they believe the value of the item was at the time of the loss. So, for example, if you have a 5-year-old television at the time of the loss, then they may take a look at it and say, okay, a new television might be $1,000, but we're going to discount that because at the time, that particular item in and of itself was, 5 years old. While if you have a replacement cost value policy, you might very well be able to go to the insurance company and say, hey, listen, look, it's going to cost me this much to get a new television, so therefore pay that. So I think it's important to take a look at the policy that you're purchasing to make sure that it has all the coverages that you're going to ultimately need, and whether or not it's an actual cost value or replacement cost value in terms of what you're really going to be dealing with. Another thing that you
Excuse
really
me,
want
Attorney Fletcher,
Sure.
quick question. Is there a difference in costs between one policy versus another? I'm sure people might be thinking about that.
Great question. Great question. Many times when it comes to replacement costs, those are going to be a higher cost policy. And the reason why is because, I mean, just by, us kind of being deductive, it's going to cost more to replace those items than it is to actually pay on something that has depreciated in value, gone down in value, right, over time. So, the insurance company is going to charge a little bit more, but many times the cost difference is not so large to go underinsured, if that makes sense. It's not a gamble that you really want to take, skimping in that area if you can actually have more coverage. I always say, folks, it's always good to have more coverage than not. That's my rule of thumb when it comes to insurance. Another good thing to do also, in terms of protecting your personal property as a renter, is keep a running inventory of all of apartment contents, because what can happen in the wake of a disaster, in the wake of a storm, is if you have items that are either flushed away due to storm surge, water, and things of that nature, you may very well not be able to substantiate those items having ever been there. So keep an inventory of your apartment contents. That's going to be extremely, extremely important. Um, Also, another key thing that I've found to be very persuasive with insurance companies is to be able to search equivalent items and do a compare and contrast of those values. So whether that means, using an Amazon, using a Walmart website, something like that, in order to be able to look at these items so you can say, hey, listen, insurance company, this is the item that I had, and this is exactly how much it's going to cost to ultimately replace it. That can help to bolster your claims, if you end up having a claim with the renter's insurance. Also, reserving storage units. That's another really, really, really big thing, that's extremely important in terms of protecting your personal property. Many times, in the wake of a storm, you have, a loss of property, or you may even have to store property someplace else because the actual dwelling itself, the home or the unit, is compromised. So the landlord will have to deal with his insurance company in order to deal with it. You may have to move your things out of it. So having a storage units is going to be extremely, extremely important. Also, take before and after photos. If your home is in fully furnished shape in terms of all the items that you have within your unit or within your property, take before photos, and then after disaster, take the after photos. Being able to have that compare and contrast to show in a claim is extremely important and very persuasive in terms of getting coverage. Just some action items. This is just generalized in terms of you as a renter, or you just having a property. Know your storm evacuation routes. That is going to be key, key, key. If a storm is coming through, you want to know exactly how you're going to be able to get out of Dodge, because what's more important than anything else is your life, and not having to sit in place in a situation that can be very, very dangerous. Also, remove any outdoor furniture, and store them. So if you're in a unit and you have a balcony, and you have some items that, outside in that balcony, they can become projectiles that can damage, any sliding glass door or glass windows and things of that nature. Move those items inside. Also, store information in waterproof containers. So any of your important documents, your renter's policy, um, cash, um, birth certificates, anything like that, store those things in waterproof containers. You can get those items from Home Depot, Walmart, what have you. Just make sure you have those items protected. It's going to be extremely important in the wake of a disaster. Um, Also, take, like I said, take before and after photos of the interior and exterior of your contents. Make sure you fill up all your gas tanks in your cars, because you don't want to be in a situation to where power is out and you can't drive because you have an empty a gas tank. It's going to be extremely important. And also prepare a running list of inventory, like I said before. Also, some other coverages to really be aware of when it comes to your renter's policy. Some renters insurance have additional coverages you can purchase, for example, for liability. So accidents that may happen within the property. Many times, homeowners policies cover those types of things. So for a landlord, he may have that kind of policy. But if you're a renter and say, for example, you have guests, there might be carve outs there. So it's important that you look for the most complete coverage in your renter's insurance policy. So, things that cover, like I said, property accidents, accidents that happen on the property, injuries that happen on your property. Also health coverage. So for example, if you do have a storm that comes in, and say you have water damage in your property, and you may have mold exposure, and you might be impacted, or your family members may be impacted, there may be some coverages under your renter's insurance to deal with that as well, just in case your health insurance doesn't come in and cover all that. Also, any lost wages that might incur because you have to either take time off to deal with the property, or have to take time off to deal with any kind of health related issues that may impact you.
If I may just ask a quick question. So, of course, we know that the landlord owns the building,
Yes.
right? And obviously has insurance himself, herself, or in the case of a business, itself.
Should. Yep.
So, as a tenant anticipates getting, insurance to cover those personal items, is it also important perhaps to touch base with the landlord so that we sort of know what is already covered? And this personal property, of course, speaks to what the tenant owns.
Yes.
But I'm curious because the mold exposure, for example, this is mold exposure triggered by something that the landlord has done, or this is mold exposure that might happen as a result of the storm. So doesn't the landlord have some responsibility there as well? Because
Abs-
that mold exposure coverage might be very expensive, no?
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And there's definitely going to be responsibility on the landlord side, and many times the landlord's policies have coverage for mold when it comes to him remediating the property. And I think having an open dialogue with your landlord is extremely important. Your landlord can provide you even a copy of his policy if you request it, and say, "Hey, listen, can I get a copy of your policy that you have so I can take a look at it myself?" You can even take a copy of your landlord's policy and provide it to your renter's provider, so that they can take a look at it and see where there are gaps in the coverage. I think that's extremely important too as well. Yes, yes. Keep that open
Some
dialogue.
advanced planning, exactly. Thank you.
Yes.
Wonderful.
And just a couple of things that I've kind of seen, as I've worked through the industry, typical areas where, you may see a denial of your coverage if you ultimately have a claim. A couple of things that insurance companies look for, right? And these are some of the things that they typically employ in terms of if they are going to be doing denials. So if you make a claim and they may claim that, hey, listen, you delayed your reporting, right? But many times within these policies, they don't define exactly how long a delay is. They don't say, oh, 10 days is considered to be delay, 20 days is considered to be delay. So what I always say in this situation is don't accept this no answer. Definitely reach out to an attorney or someone, a professional who can actually help you to navigate this, because at the end of the day, sometimes delays just happen because of the fact that you can't be in that area. If you had to move temporarily to another location because of the damage to the structure, then that may very well factor into delay. So delayed reporting is something that insurance companies typically use to try to deny. Also, a failure to provide clear valuations. This is another area where things can get kind of tricky. Like I said before, when it comes to actual cost value versus replacement cost value, when it comes to these policies, many times insurance companies are going to nitpick. What you provide is in terms of your sales receipts and in terms of your equivalent values. But I think the most important thing is to have this documentation, to have the strongest argument when it comes to your claim. So, having prior photographs is going to be key in terms of fighting this one. Also, a failure to disclose what they call material misrepresentation, right? So carriers sometimes claim that even if they disagree with your valuations, that in of itself could be a misrepresentation. Well, that's not necessarily the case. You may very well be representing and saying that, hey, listen, look, this is what I believe the value of these items are based on the equivalents that I found and also based on the receipts that I have. So for them to just claim that this is a material misrepresentation, do not take that answer in and of itself as carte blanche that not going to ultimately get coverage. So definitely get a professional when it comes to those situations as well. Also, a failure to cooperate. Many times I've seen insurance companies use this as a basis to deny, and many times the failure to cooperate is based on circumstance. Like I said before, you may have had to move outside of the area, so you might not have been able to allow, the carrier to do an inspection of your contents. These things tend to end up happening, and it's important to get help when it comes to those types of situations, and don't just accept that denial of failure to cooperate because of forces outside of your control. And I know Attorney Lawless is going to really be discussing about the FEMA programs for renters, in the next presentation.
Thank you so much, Attorney Fletcher. We will continue, but I should say to the audience, please don't hesitate to put your questions in the chat. As you may know, we provided you with an opportunity right after deciding to do this program to let us know what your questions were, what your concerns were, and we've done our best to try and anticipate that in a very short period of time we're trying to respond. But please give us your questions, and we hope to get to them at the end of this segment. Moving on now, we are anxious and excited to hear the next segment speaker. And now we've shifted from what you should do before, and I think Attorney Fletcher gave all of us some, shall I say, a checklist of things, some things that we need to work on right now. But now let's shift to the rules and the information that you need to know and the steps that you should take if you're in the midst of a hurricane. And toward that end, please welcome me in joining Attorney John Lawless. He is a staff attorney with Bay Area Legal Services, specifically in the Disaster Relief Project section. Attorney Lawless holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Florida, an MBA from Stetson, as well as a law degree from Stetson University. Prior to joining Bay Area Legal Services, Attorney Lawless worked in the private sector, both as a general title counsel and as a practitioner in the areas of practicing in the areas of real estate, estate planning, probate, business, and nonprofit law. And one of the things that we're very excited about is that we have experts who are here to give you the inside story so that you can understand exactly what your rights are given these circumstances. Attorney Lawless, welcome back. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I am here to talk to you really about two items. The first thing I'm going to go over, obviously, as you can see from the slide, is assistance that's immediately available to tenants in the wake of disaster. The second thing that we'll move on to, so just bear with me as we get through, is just some of your basic rights when it comes to landlord-tenant relationships. But first, I want to address some of the things that are going to become immediately available to you. As you can see from this first slide, one of the most important things is access to food in the wake of disaster. To that end, especially in the state of Florida, and typically nationally, it depends state by state, but in the state of Florida, DCF has the SNAP program. If you're not familiar with what SNAP is, it's Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And what it does is it just allows people to, on a regular basis, even in non-emergency situations, get access to the food that they need. In an emergency situation, obviously, the need for that expands to a larger percentage of the population. So this sort of relief comes in three basic types in the circumstance of a disaster. The first one is replacement SNAP. What replacement SNAP is it's just food that you already had that you lost as a result of the disaster. So the government does step in, it provides you with relief to be able to replace that food. Typically, they like to make sure that you have somewhere to store that food. These other two are gonna address some of the more immediate needs if you don't have power, if you don't have access to anything to be able to preserve your food. The second one is supplemental SNAP. Now, as I mentioned before, there are regular SNAP recipients. There are people who just need food assistance on an ongoing basis. But in the wake of a disaster, their regular SNAP benefits may not be sufficient to provide for the additional need created by the storm. So what supplemental SNAP is it's just exactly what it sounds like, a supplement to the regular SNAP benefits. And typically what the idea is to bring the regular SNAP benefits up into line with what the government would be providing with the third option, the DSNAP, and that's disaster SNAP assistance. That is assistance that's available to households that typically would not otherwise qualify for SNAP at all. But obviously, in the wake of disaster, there are extraordinary needs. So even if you are not a normal, regular SNAP recipient, you are able to apply for these special benefits and get food provided. One of the important things to keep in mind is with normal SNAP benefits, if you're familiar with it, typically don't qualify for purchase of hot food items. There is an exception made for DSNAP because the government is essentially aware of the fact that you're not going to have the ability to necessarily cook the food that you purchase. So you are allowed with DSNAP to purchase these hot food items. Very important to keep in mind. The second component, and actually the SNAP can be closely related to this, is the FEMA individual assistance. FEMA assistance really comes in two basic types. That's public assistance and individual assistance. People will hear that public assistance is coming, thinking that it's assistance to the public. What it really is assistance to public works. So that's to the local government in terms of infrastructure. What you want to keep an eye out for is individual assistance. Those are the programs that actually help people, individual citizens. Now, if you were with us for our former presentation, you're going to see a lot of similar information. But for those that are just joining us, we're going to go through a lot of the basics of what it is. There are two basic types of assistance that come with individual assistance. That's housing assistance, which does apply to renters as well as homeowners, and other needs assistance. That's basically anything that doesn't involve actual shelter. To qualify for those two types of assistance, you need to be in some of these categories at least, either a citizen, a non-citizen national, that means a permanent resident, or a qualified alien. What that means in these circumstances are asylum seekers, domestic violence victims. There are a few others, but those are the two major ones. Now, you only need one member of a household that qualifies for this. So if you have a family with only, for instance, a minor child that qualifies as a citizen or a permanent resident, the entire household can apply for FEMA benefits based on that one person. So you don't have to pick and choose. One important thing to keep in mind when it comes to being a renter with households that if you have a roommate, for instance, that you're not necessarily related to, but you're living in the same dwelling, you are a household for FEMA purposes. So if your roommate applies for FEMA assistance before you, they will be considered the applicant. You will be considered a household member. If you've put in a second application after that first application, your application is probably going to be denied. And it is going to be between you and your roommate to determine how those benefits are distributed. They're going to give them to the roommate if the roommate applies first. So just be aware of that. It's a good idea to have a plan in place beforehand for exactly how that's going to be handled, but it can create some issues, and FEMA is not going to directly step in to assist with that. That's going to become something that you're going to have to deal with in any number of ways if you don't have an advanced plan. FEMA assistance can be applied for in a few different ways. They have a website, they have a phone number, they both have them listed here on this slide. A lot of the times you're not going to have access to either the internet or a regular phone. So FEMA also, when individual assistance is declared for a county or requested by the county from FEMA, and FEMA is able to provide it, set up what are called DRCs, or disaster resource centers. These are great places for everybody, both homeowners and renters, to go. This is a centralized place where you can apply for FEMA relief. You can apply for that SNAP relief. You can apply for unemployment assistance. All of these things are available in the wake of a disaster for survivors. So keep in mind that you have options for all of these things: food, shelter, income. And a good place to go are going to be these disaster resource centers. You are probably, in the wake of a disaster, going to see a lot of immediate volunteers, both staff members from your county. These are the first people that you typically see, both during and immediately after the storm, and volunteers come in. They come in through organizations that are generally known as VOADs, Volunteer Organizations Active in Disaster, or COADs. It's the same sort of thing. And those organizations have a lot of connections to the other immediate disaster relief services that are available. So speak to the people who come into your neighborhoods, come into your homes. They're going to be able to give you a lot of information on how to reach those disaster resource centers. You can also dial 211 on your phone anywhere in Central Florida. That's going to take you to a United Way service that provides a lot of important information with respect to both disasters and general help. So you don't necessarily need to be in the middle of a disaster for that to be useful to you, but it certainly is in the wake of a disaster. When you're applying for individual assistance, they're going to want your social security number, or TIN in the case of some of the other non-citizen applicants, a description of what you've lost, your insurance information, because FEMA assistance is meant to be a supplement to your actual insurance policy. If you are covered by insurance, FEMA individual assistance for property replacement is secondary. So if you have another way to get it, FEMA is not going to provide that to you until they see that you are either not qualified under an insurance policy, or on occasion they will provide the assistance in advance and then basically ask to be paid back later. So even if you do have insurance, you can apply. They can provide temporary assistance that you then have to repay, almost like an interest-free loan.
So let me ask a question. I apologize. So we just heard from Attorney Fletcher that you should be very calculating about the specific things that your policy covers. So does this mean that if you did not incorporate something and are now, if you will, exposed literally and figuratively, because now we're in the midst of the storm, you don't have coverage, as long as you show that your insurance policy is limited, that will then enable FEMA to step in to fill that gap?
That's correct. FEMA assistance isn't just for people who are entirely uninsured. It is also for people who are what they say are underinsured. So if you do have that gap, and particularly if you can provide that denial from your insurance company that these items are not covered, you can still be eligible for FEMA relief. It's not one or the other. It can be both working together. So yeah, thank you for that question. That's very important for people to realize. With respect to housing assistance in particular, they're going to want to know the property location and also some telephone contact info. That sounds really simple, that last one, but it's something that you generally do want to plan for in advance, because you are not guaranteed to have regular access to a telephone in the wake of a disaster. So speaking to other members of your immediate community, family members, so that you can have a plan in place for providing this information, how you are going to have somebody get in contact with you, from FEMA, from Department of Children and Families, from any of the other organizations, Red Cross, United Way, that do come in. Just think about that in advance. Make it part of your disaster plan, because that is an important thing to have. FEMA individual assistance, typically you have to apply for it within 60 days of the disaster declaration. That comes pretty quickly in the wake of the actual disaster striking, occasionally beforehand. They extend that to 120 days for good cause shown. Good cause for FEMA is pretty broad. They actually are really generous with this sort of thing. So if you find yourself just outside of that 60 days or just outside of that 120 days, don't be afraid to apply anyway. The nice thing about FEMA, as opposed to some of the other programs that are out there, is they actually are very generous. They are interested in helping. If you can show good cause, sometimes good cause can be as simple as, I wasn't provided the information, I wasn't able to find counsel, and they will accept that because they are there to help. They're not there to cut you off at the deadline. It is not a guarantee, obviously, if you fall outside of those deadlines, and it's a good idea to try to get them in beforehand, but don't feel defeated if you miss those deadlines. Absolutely try, and they will work with you if they can. FEMA also extends these deadlines regularly. I have the example there. deadline was extended all up to January 12th for a September storm. So just keep that in mind. Try to keep the deadlines if you can, but don't worry if you miss them. You're going to have to certify that you actually lived there at the time of the disaster. That does not necessarily mean that you were there at the time of the disaster. This is very important. As I'm going through these things, I'm going to list a lot of information, a lot of technical things that you're supposed to do. Do not prioritize doing these technical things over escaping the disaster, over keeping yourself safe. I'm going to be talking a little bit about letters that you can write to your landlord. Do not delay your escaping the path of the storm so that you can write this letter. It will be able to be taken care of afterwards. It is important, of course, to have an advance plan, but when you are facing down an imminent problem, absolutely prioritize your life. The rest of it can be dealt with later. You're going to have to certify that you suffered some damage. You're going to have to certify that your coverage is inadequate or that you don't have any insurance. For both homeowners and renters, more homeowners, but occasionally renters when it comes to housing assistance, the FEMA may also forward you to the SBA, which is sort of counterintuitive. SBA is the Small Business Administration. If they do so, feel free to make that application. You don't have to worry about it, which I'm happy to talk about on the next slide. SBA steps in along with FEMA as well in a lot of these circumstances. They're there to provide both real property for homeowners and personal property replacement and assistance to disaster survivors. You do not have to be associated with a business. You don't have to be the employee of a business. You don't have to own a business. It just happens to be coming through the Small Business Administration of the system. But this is for individuals. It really does not have anything to do with businesses aside from the fact that this administration is named for businesses. They can provide unsecured loans up to $25,000 to individuals. These do have to be paid back. Your eligibility is based on your ability to repay, but this is available to both renters and homeowners for the replacement of personal property as well as real property. So
Now, Attorney Lawless, let me just interrupt very quickly. I apologize, but some people may not understand what it means to say unsecured. So could we just go into a little more detail about that? What it means when it's secured versus unsecured? I think that might be helpful for our audience as well. Thank you.
I can, absolutely. What a secured loan is the sort of loan that you're referring to when you, for instance, take a car loan, take a mortgage. And what it means is that loan is, the payment of that loan is secured by generally the thing that you purchase, but it can be other things. So for instance, with your car loan, if you don't pay your car loan, your car can be repossessed. The car is the security. With a mortgage, your home can be foreclosed upon. The home is the security. So when you have an unsecured loan, it is a loan that there's nothing specific to have repossessed. So for instance, with this $25,000 loan, if you get an unsecured $25,000 loan from the SBA and you use it to buy clothes or even appliances, they can't take those back from you if you refuse to pay. They can, of course, sue you. They can attempt to get a judgment against you. They can engage in wage garnishment, things like that. But they can't just come and take the specific things that were bought with that money because that loan itself was not secured by those things. So when we're talking about this money, this is just money that needs to be paid back. But again, you're not dealing with repossession. Those larger loans for replacement typically are focused more on homeowners. You can apply at sba.gov for these. You can apply by phone at the phone number provided. You can also apply in person at those DRCs that I discussed. Again, those DRCs are wonderful resources. Another really important thing for renters is that the SBA offers critical needs assistance, and that's $500 per household. That is not a loan. That is a $500 grant for assistance, in addition to assistance that you may be able to receive from FEMA. Now, FEMA will take into account that $500 grant if you do receive it. And this is what I was talking about before. FEMA will often refer you to the SBA to receive assistance. The SBA will analyze you either for a loan or for this critical needs assistance. With respect to loans, you are allowed to say no, even if you are approved. That's an important thing to keep in mind. So you can get the terms, look at the terms, say, no, I don't really like these terms, so I'm not accepting this. Go back to FEMA with the information that you have refused the terms of the loan, and you can still get FEMA assistance. So don't be afraid about the SBA application. Don't be concerned that you are going to get yourself into a situation where you have to take out a loan. There are some situations for homeowners in which that may be the case, but not really for anything that has to do with renters. So even if you do not want one of those unsecured loans and FEMA is asking you to apply, go ahead and apply. Say no, thank you. Have the SBA give that information to FEMA, because you can't give it to them yourself. They need to see it from the SBA to make sure that it's legitimate. And then you can proceed with your application for FEMA relief. None of this is going to exclude you from FEMA relief, except in the circumstance that you get the $500 reward or award from the SBA. And all that is going to do is get your reward reduced from FEMA by that same $500. It's not going to exclude you from all relief. So you're never really going to lose out by doing this. You're also allowed to appeal SBA decisions. A lot of the times this doesn't come up, particularly for renters, because they are actively looking to be denied. But in the case that you do want to, there are some specific steps that you can take. You can ask for a simple reconsideration within 6 months. And then if that is denied, you can go to the director of the SBA. Their determinations are final, so there's not really much you can do beyond that. And again, you'll see here when FEMA requests or requires an SBA loan application, that denial is not a denial of those FEMA benefits. You just need the SBA to send that information directly to FEMA that you've either been denied, or have refused the relief, and then FEMA can just continue to do its job. FEMA appeals are probably the bigger issue for a lot of people. FEMA appeals can be pretty tricky. Mostly because the FEMA application is done in some language that's a little complex even for me as a professional to read through sometimes. The important thing to note that a FEMA denial is not a final determination. You are allowed to appeal the decisions to deny benefits. There are a lot of resources that you can use to help. Disasterrelief.org. We'll see that at the end of the presentation as well. Has a self-help tool for appeals. It's also a good idea to contact your local legal aid organizations or professionals for help with this, because it can be a little bit complex. But FEMA, sometimes you'll even speak to the FEMA ground teams, will actually encourage you to file these appeals. FEMA is not looking to deny this. They really have no personal interest in denying relief. It's just a matter of making sure that it actually fits their standards. FEMA may also request additional information with respect to any of the claims that are made or applications that are made. You want to respond to these within the 21 days that they give you. If you can't respond within the 21 days, it's a good idea to just ask for an extension. Again, FEMA is really generous with its deadlines. If you just keep engaged with them, they are there to help. It's not like dealing with an adverse party like an insurance company can be. They are not looking for denials. They're not looking to save money. It's not their money. It's government assistance. They are there to help. They do have their own line for assistance, but again, it's generally a good idea to ask outside and get as much assistance as you possibly can. The people at the DRCs in particular aren't allowed to give a lot of specific information, but they can give you some general guidance. When you get those denials, you can also request a copy of your file from FEMA. That's a good idea, just so you have an idea of exactly what it is you're responding to.
Excuse me, Attorney Lawless. I'm going to mention this now, but ask for a response later. You just indicated that these applications are very difficult to complete. Of course, our audience consists of people from all specters of life. We want to make sure that ultimately everybody is able to complete this appeal. One of the questions I want to raise is, well, where do I go to get help? How do I find someone who can assist me? So I'm just putting that out there in anticipation of the questions a little bit later, but there might be some room here as I'm listening to this for our law students to step up and perhaps help legal aid to help people with this. So perhaps there's another way in which our law students can be of help, just so we get more people on the ground, so to speak, to assist. So we'll follow up with that in a moment. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I'd be thrilled to talk about that.
Yes, yes. We want to talk about, here's how you do it, but how do I really do it? So
Exactly.
yes. Okay, there's a little bit more here.
Okay. So yeah, as I was saying before, FEMA does operate a helpline for both applications and appeals. There's that 800 number, that 800-621-3362. So that's kind of a first line that you can go to. Again, we'll get into some more ways later, but that's a good first option. A lot of the causes for the denials are you're unable to prove, as I said, in ownership, in this case, basically residence in the property. And there are some misunderstandings of some basic terms of the application. Unwilling to relocate, that applies both to owners and renters. What unwilling to relocate just means is, are you willing to live somewhere else temporarily while issues are fixed? Now, this has to do both with, physical damage to the structure, which is more an issue for the landlord, but for other items affecting unlivability, not being able, for instance, to pass roads, etc. You can get temporary housing assistance as a renter from FEMA as well, as long as you are willing to go somewhere else. They will provide that. So just make sure they're not asking you to move necessarily. They're asking you to relocate while everything gets fixed. Home is safe to occupy. Again, this has a lot to do with homeownership, but this can come into play for rental applications as well, just because your landlord isn't necessarily going to apply for the relief. Often they will because it's there and available, but if they're not and you're stuck waiting, you can apply for, again, housing assistance relief. If you say that your rental unit is safe to occupy, you're typically not going to get it. They don't mean that a portion of it is okay or it's livable, but it needs to be fixed. They mean that it is in such a condition that it would really have no need for particular repairs. So that's what safe to occupy really means. The last item I'm going to go ahead and skip past. I really should have probably taken that out for renters, unfortunately. That has a lot more to do with ownership. All right, now that we've gotten through some of the actual relief available, I'm going to get into the actual general landlord-tenant relationship and some of the options available to tenants, both of rental units and what can be a little more complex mobile homes. So without further ado, we'll just jump in. And one important thing to keep in mind is a lot of people assume that there's going to be some special rule that snaps into place when a disaster strikes. And there really isn't anything in Florida statutes that specifically puts in place a new or unique rule with respect to your normal landlord-tenant relationship. There are some existing rights that exist either both in the case of a disaster and outside of a disaster, but it does not have to do with a specific disaster declaration. So the first thing that you really need to think about is reading your lease if you have a written lease. Not everybody has a written lease, in which case the default rules apply, and I'm going to talk a lot about that actually. But the number one thing, much like with your insurance policy, read your lease, know what the provisions are. A huge problem is both with landlords and tenants that they don't actually know what their lease agreement says. Tenants just know that they're getting a certain price for a certain amount of time and go forward with that. Landlords even just don't really know what to do. They'll pull leases from the internet. For instance, I've seen a lot of times you're looking at a Massachusetts lease for a Florida property because they've just chosen the first thing that they found in a Google search. So read that, be familiar with your rights. Also, if you're interested, there are a lot of resources, especially with legal aid, that will assist you in interpreting any of the issues that you may find. So there are resources out there to do that. But make sure if you have a written lease, you have a copy of your lease and you're generally familiar with the terms. In general, even in the wake of a disaster, you're still going to owe rent. There's nothing special that kicks in the statute that's going to really even delay your need to pay the rent. Now, if you have a written lease, you might have what's called a force majeure clause that can kick in and alleviate or eliminate some of the obligations under that lease when there is an act of God, such as a hurricane. That's what that force majeure means. So another reason to be really familiar with what your written lease says, but it's hard to give any specific information about that without knowing what your lease is. Another important thing to keep in mind is that tenants will often rush to make repairs to make their own living space livable. Now, you have to keep in mind that if you are going to do that, you really shouldn't do that, first of all, without the permission of your landlord, because that structure belongs to your landlord. They're the ones that have the right to do that. If you do something like that as well, you are not allowed to automatically deduct those costs from your rent and what you give to your landlord. You will still owe the full rent if you make repairs, whether authorized or unauthorized, unless you have that in writing. So if you are going to come to some sort of agreement with your landlord, which generally is not a great idea, let the landlord repair their property. If for some reason you are going to repair the property, make sure you have an agreement in writing with your landlord with respect to those specific obligations. But in general, just keep in mind, this is the landlord's obligation, not your obligation. Landlords do have an obligation to maintain the property in a safe condition. The unfortunate thing is there's not really a specific consequence in the statutes for them not doing so. Again, another reason to be really familiar with your lease, because your lease may have provisions as to what happens if the landlord doesn't properly maintain the property, but by statute, all this really does is allow the tenant to affirmatively assert some rights, but the tenant really does have to take affirmative steps. So we're going to get into a little bit of that on this next one. Now, if you're in a property that's been damaged by a hurricane, there is a specific provision that allows of the Florida statutes that allows you to give notice of termination if the property is destroyed. This comes into play both with hurricanes. This comes into play if the house catches fire and burns down outside of a general disaster situation. But if your unit is destroyed, you may give notice to your landlord that you are terminating your lease. Now, if it's not completely destroyed or it's uninhabitable for other reasons, you need to give what's called a 7-day notice to your landlord to cure the condition of the property before you take any action to either terminate or to withhold rent. So you have to keep that in mind. This is what I was talking about with those affirmative obligations. You have all these rights, but if you do not send these letters, for instance, if the property is obviously diminished in value, but you can still live in it, and you say, oh, I can live in half of it, I'll just pay half the rent. If you do not send that 7-day notice to your landlord properly, they can still file an eviction against you and likely be successful because you did not follow the proper steps in giving those 7-day notices. Those 7-day notices, forms for them are widely available at a lot of legal aid sites. If you're unable to access those, contacting a legal professional is great advice in any sort of situation like this. Again, the notices are fairly simple, but they are also very specific as to what they have to contain via statute.
Let me ask a quick question, if I may.
Sure.
So the 7-day notice is something that you can write on a slip of paper, or do you have to actually go to the court and get an actual document? How formal is that notice?
Now, the notice is formal to the extent that there is some specific language that it needs to contain. It doesn't need to be. It's not a lot of legalese. It needs to contain a description of the issue, a statement that the landlord has 7 days to cure that, or the tenant is going to either withhold rent in the amount of blank, whatever that happens to be, or they are going to terminate the lease without further notice. Now, that can be written on a piece of paper by hand and delivered to the landlord. If you are going to deliver it to the landlord in that way, it is a good idea to take a picture of the delivery or document the delivery, have a witness to the delivery. The address that you're going to make that delivery to is generally going to be specified in your lease. Otherwise, if you don't have a written lease, it's to your normal place of delivery of your rent, unless you have another specific agreement with your landlord. but it is a good idea to document that. You can just write it on a piece of notebook paper, in pencil even, as long as it's signed and has that important information. Generally, though, it's a good idea to take a look at the resources available and make sure that you have it right.
Thank you.
My pleasure. And again, I just want to emphasize too, tenants do not have a right to make repairs to the property without the landlord's permission. Even though it's rendering it uninhabitable, they can't go in there and hire their own contractors, fix the roof, fix a door, anything like that. I mean, you can make simple. Oh, sorry, I just saw a message from Jacob come through in the chat. But I do want to get through the permission with respect to repairs. You do not have an automatic right to make any sorts of structural repairs to the property. Obviously, you can put tarps, shore up your door, make sure that you're not being inundated with rain in that particular circumstance, but actually taking affirmative steps to make repairs, that is something that you need the landlord's permission to do. And again, as I said before, that's typically an actual landlord obligation. So my recommendation in most circumstances is to let the landlord do what they need to do. Even with that permission, like I said, that you cannot deduct those costs. You're still going to owe the full amount of rent. This is just the general rule inside and outside of a disaster. If rent is owed and not pay, landlords can file for an eviction after they give you a 3-day notice. This applies in the wake of a disaster just as much as it does in any other circumstance. So that's important to keep in mind. A lot of people rightfully leave the area and they're not able to return for a little bit of time. If your rent is not up to date when you do that, the possibility exists that a 3-day notice could be posted on your door. So if you can, be sure to keep your rent up to date. That 3-day notice only needs to be posted. They don't need to mail it to you. They don't need to hire a process server. That comes later. Also, it's important to take a look at your lease to make sure there aren't any additional termination notices. If you do not have a written lease and you're just going week to week, month to month, etc., landlords can terminate your lease without particular cause as long as they give you specific notice. I have a couple of examples here. Do the most common. If it's week to week, they have to give you 7 days notice and then you have to be out. If it is month to month, they only have to give you 15 days notice before you have to get out. The reason this is important, a lot of the times these landlords have families. They'll say, you know what, I've got a house over here that's just fine. I just have a tenant in it. I'm going to go ahead and tell them that they have to leave so they can place their own family members or themselves even. Keep in mind, unfortunately, in the circumstance that you have, that they give a legitimate notice, these notices do require you to leave or be subject to an eviction. You can sit there and wait and make them evict you, of course. However, that eviction is going to make it very, very difficult for you to rent in the future. So if you see these notices, definitely contact a legal professional as soon as possible. Make sure that there is some legitimacy to them, and if they do, act quickly. So just keep that in mind. They can also presume property is abandoned. This becomes a problem in major disasters too. If you leave the property for more than 15 days, keep in mind, that's really only 2 weeks in the wake of a disaster. Landlords are often able to presume that the property is abandoned. They can take a number of steps, including securing and retaking the property. And this is before an eviction is filed as well. Most of the time, what we call self-help is not available in the state of Florida, but in terms of securing the property, in the case of abandonment, they are allowed to at least secure it. This can easily be avoided by giving notice to the landlord in advance of an absence like this. Or not necessarily even in advance, but before that 15 days expires. Like I said, get out first. Don't sit in your house writing this notice to your landlord that I'm going to be absent for 15 days and try to get it to them when the storm is coming. Evacuate first. Just communicate with your landlord within those 15 days.
And so ultimately, we're talking again about preserving your records, well, creating your records, preserving them, and then, of course, providing this information to your landlord after you're safe. Is that a good overview?
Yes,
Very
absolutely.
Good. Thank you.
It's particularly with that 15-day abandonment notice. That's not really something that you can take care of in advance. You can't you can't say to your landlord, "Oh, okay, in about a month I see a hurricane's coming, so I'm going to be gone for 15 days." Don't worry too much about that one. Just if you can get that written notice to your landlord, even if you can't get, ideally you send them a letter certified if you can do it. If you can't do it, if you can get a text message to your landlord at a number that you regularly communicate with them, that's generally going to be good enough in the event that they do attempt to proceed to eviction.
And take a picture of that text message so that, again, you have something to put in your file.
Absolutely, absolutely. Anytime that you're having a communication with your landlord, really in any circumstance, but especially in this circumstance, you should be keeping records.
Very good. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Well, let's move on here to talk a little bit about mobile homes.
Yes. Now, mobile homes can be a little tricky. Mobile homes sometimes fall into a middle ground between home ownership and tenancy. Now, if you're living in a mobile home and you rent both the mobile home and the lot, you're a tenant. So everything that I just said still applies. It's not really anything unique because you're in a mobile home. You just happen to have a renter relationship. Now, a lot of the times when you have people in mobile homes, they occupy the home in a park. The home itself typically is owned by the person occupying it. They just don't own the land underneath them. Now, this is that sort of middle ground. I'm going to skip ahead again one more time. If you own both the mobile home and the land that it sits on, you're just a homeowner. So there's really no special provision that you have to deal with there. All of the home ownership rules apply. There's no special rule with respect to FEMA even there. It's just you are a homeowner. But if you own your mobile home and you are on a lot, you fall under the Florida Mobile Home Act. One other circumstance I should mention is that mobile home park has to have 10 or more, or they're not covered by these provisions. Just like with the other rental situations, you want to review your lease. There are a lot more protections with respect to mobile homeowners. For instance, if you are falling into this category, you're not going to be week to week, month to month on your lot rent. They can't just give you 15 days notice, say, all right, unhook your trailer, it's time to go. Doesn't work. A lot more notice. Typically you have to get at least 60 days on a year. A lot of the times it's longer than that. A couple of things to keep in mind, though, is for mobile homes that are destroyed in a mobile home park, the actual lot is the renter's responsibility. Keep in mind, you're not renting an actual unit. You are just renting a tract of land. So the debris from the mobile home, a lot of the times that's going to be the responsibility of the mobile homeowner. The park isn't going to do anything about that other than complain about the fact eventually that there is debris on the property. They are generally responsible for the common areas, etc. But as far as debris on your actual lot, you are just renting the lot. They have no specific obligation with respect to any of the removal. The other thing to keep in mind is, much like your rent in the wake of a disaster, lot rent is due as regularly as it was before disaster. That's even more applicable here because, again, you are only renting bare land. So if the mobile home is destroyed, that doesn't affect your rent. There's no diminution in the value. Sorry, what that means, there's no less value. Remember, I said before, if the property that you're renting, if you're renting an apartment building and it becomes worth less, you can withhold some of that rent as long as you give that notice. None of that applies to a mobile home because as long as there is land for a mobile home to occupy, you still have that rental to do. I don't think that I mentioned, now that I bring that up, I'm sorry for skipping back one, but in terms of withholding rent, there is no specific rule for how much rent to withhold. I don't think I even have a note on that, but that's important to keep in mind when you're giving that 7-day notice that says, I'm withholding 5 rent. There's not somewhere in the statute that you can go and point to and say, this was a reasonable amount of rent to withhold. That's going to be a fact-based determination. That can be really tricky. It can be really risky to withhold rent, even if you give the proper notice, because it's up to you, the landlord, and the judge in a hearing to determine what that actual value was. And no one's really going out and hiring valuation experts when it comes to an eviction like that. So a lot of the time, it's just the three of you in a room figuring it out. And if you got it wrong, you can be evicted. So just keep that in mind.
Keep that in mind. Let me ask you a little bit about the tenant withholding rent.
Sure.
Does it help if the tenant places those funds in a separate account or otherwise has proof that the tenant was otherwise capable of paying the rent, but that they withheld it for this specific purpose? Would that also help the case for you as the lawyer, if they can show that they actually had the funds?
The answer is sort of yes and no. The answer, the more important answer is probably yes. Practically speaking, it certainly helps convince the court. With respect to the statute, it doesn't really matter. So there's no particular legal reason that you need to prove that you had the money, but practically speaking, when you're in front of a judge, it does help to say, look, I have it. It's just actually, it's actually diminished in value that much.
Really showing good faith that they actually had it, but did not release it for these specific reasons.
Exactly. So the other thing that is available to tenants, particularly when you're dealing with eviction, is depositing the amount of rent due in the registry. This is important, particularly when we're talking about non-payment. One of the prerequisites to defending an eviction in the case of a non-payment is that you deposit the amount of rent due in the court registry before you're even allowed to raise any other defenses. That's a really important thing to keep in mind for two reasons. First of all, even if you have a good defense, but you don't deposit the rent in the registry, you can still be defaulted, even if you file an answer with those good defenses, except for what's called a motion to determine rent. If you file a motion to determine rent, that is exactly what you're going to file in the case that you've withheld rent, saying, look, I know what my regular lease agreement says, but here are the reasons that it's not worth that much. So you have to do that when you're responding to these evictions. And even in that circumstance, it's a facts and circumstances situation. It's also not always a good idea to deposit that money in the registry. Because, for instance, let's say you didn't have the additional rent and you need to find somewhere else to move. All the money that you put in the registry is probably going to end up going to the landlord because you're going to be evicted. So that's just more money that you don't have in your pocket. So there's some strategic decisions that you need to make. Again, that's not specific advice for any individual circumstance, but things to keep in mind. When you are facing circumstances like this, it's important to contact a legal professional as soon as possible. The bar operates a helpline, legal aid operates helplines, so call as soon as possible. A lot of the times we get these calls on day 6 of a 7-day, and it's really hard to help.
Right. Well, we're approaching the end. We've got a little more information. You've been fabulous, as have all of our speakers. So let's wrap up, and we may have time for a couple of questions and maybe to revisit a question that was raised earlier.
All right, I'll go through this one pretty quickly. FEMA provides what's called a 1-for-1 program for people whose mobile homes were destroyed in particular. What they do in the circumstances that you qualify is that they will actually clear the lot, give you a temporary home, and you have to recertify that you're still FEMA eligible every 30 days. They will do this for a maximum of 18 months. Afterwards, they will generally offer you the opportunity to buy that home too. There's some income requirements with respect to your household and everything that determine what that price and interest rate are. You have to certify that you're going to live there for at least another year. But at that point, you're able to replace your home through that purchase. Also, a lot of people can't afford to replace these homes. So there is a donation program through both FEMA and the Florida Department of Emergency Management that allows the money to be donated by local larger nonprofits, typically like United Way, things like that, who will hold that, who will take that title for them. And as long as those people live there for a year, the money will be paid by that organization and then the home donated after a year to the occupants. So that 1-for-1 program is really useful for mobile homeowners because a lot of the times they see some devastating damage from hurricanes in particular.
On behalf of the Western Michigan University Cooley Law School, the Ten Core Law Society, and our student organization known as the Reptiles, or the Real Property, Probate, and Trust Law Section, which is a student organization affiliated with the Florida State Bar. It's just been an absolute pleasure to welcome you, and we just have to pause and thank all of our speakers for doing an outstanding job. They had a very difficult task because this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the substantive information that they needed to share with you. But as we said at the beginning of each one of these programs, first for homeowners and now for tenants, our goal was to make sure that we didn't focus on statistics or data. We wanted to focus on your rights. And we had to make some calculated decisions about what we could cover. And of course, we could probably go on for 4 or 5 or 6 more days just to give you an indication of how much information is necessary. But there are 3 things that both our speaker, Attorney Dalmacy, mentioned, and it's been implied through this gathering. We want you to be resilient, strategic, and knowledgeable. No doubt many of us have lost loved ones. We've lost personal property. But notwithstanding that, and while we certainly mourn with families, at the same time as lawyers, we thought that it was absolutely our obligation to make sure that we talk to you about this essential information. So we're going to conclude now by taking a few questions. I think we have some in the hopper. And let me now introduce one of our students. I'm very proud of this young man. He is the student president and co-moderator, Jacob Goss. I think he has a few questions from the audience, and I have one final question, and it's actually a proposal. It'll revisit something that I talked to Attorney Lawless about. But Mr. Goss, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. And first, I just want to thank the panelists and all the audience for attending and being here today. Our first question actually comes from the survey response. And I know, Attorney Lawless, you had prepared a response to this. So our first question is, what is Florida doing to prevent fraudulent contractors?
I can give an answer to that question, but the more important question that I would ask in response to that is why this would be coming from a tenant. I discussed before how important it is to keep in mind that these repairs typically are the landlord's responsibility. Dealing with a contractor typically is a landlord responsibility. So if you are a tenant in the position of dealing with a contractor, something else has most likely already gone wrong. Now, there are some protections available, of course. We had a fairly extensive discussion of that earlier. The basic answer is that a lot of this has to do with specific contract law. Also with fraud, there are also some specific measures that can be taken via notice with respect to contractors who do incomplete or shoddy work. That information is available at the Attorney General's website. And also, if you find yourself in a situation like that, it's often a good idea, again, it's in with most of these things, to contact counsel. But the basic information to keep in mind as a tenant is you are not typically responsible for hiring contractors for repair. This is not something that should be your obligation. And if your landlord is doing this to you, there's a more fundamental question to ask.
Excellent. Any other questions, Mr. Goss?
That is the only prepared question we have at the moment.
Okay, well, I want to revisit something that we talked about briefly, and that is we've now spent 3 hours under the homeowner section and now under the tenant section talking about the forms and the documents and the procedures. And on the one hand, we know that when people are in the midst of the storm, literally and figuratively, it's very difficult to remember all of this. And that's why we will be uploading this information and making it available. So don't think that this is it. We're certainly going to make it available to those of you who have participated. And we encourage you to make sure that you share what happened here today and ultimately the link that will be available so that people can find out about it. But I want to address 2 our panelists. Is there a way to get law students involved? We have, through the Reptiles, this student organization, brilliant young minds who are willing to help in the face of disasters. Is there something that we need to integrate into this process? Because we have an ample supply of young lawyers in the making who are ready to begin this process. And perhaps there's a way that we can, try and restructure how this is done. And of course, they're not licensed, but is there any way in which we can get them integrated? I'm just curious about your thoughts, Mr. Lawless, Mr. Fletcher. You're both former law students yourselves, now in the active practice. You're brilliant lawyers. But do we need to sort of rework and come up with a new normal? Because people are desperately needing help, and we know you guys can't do it all. How's that? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, yeah, initially with respect to, we talked about the forms in particular, those 7-day notices. They're also the notice of termination when when the home you're renting is destroyed. Those are technical documents in the sense that they need to follow the statute, but they're also very simple documents to distribute. I think that's an area where law students would be able to provide a lot of help. You don't necessarily even have to give legal advice so much as make the forms available. And I don't think that there would be much of a problem with us putting together a clinic where there's a supervising attorney, allowing law students to interact with the public with respect to getting this information out. That's the biggest problem, is making sure people actually know about this. Enforcing the right is not difficult. Knowing about the right is the tough problem.
Mm-hmm. Attorney Fletcher, would you like to add to that?
I would just echo that, just in terms of really disseminating the information, disseminating the forms, and really helping people to understand the language that's in those forms. Not necessarily giving legal advice, but just a person's eye who has a legal background to really kind of say, hey, listen, these are what some of these terms ultimately mean. I think is important. Absolutely.
Well, it just seems to me that as law professors, we're certainly trying to prepare our students to sit in your seats and walk in your shoes. But personally, I was extremely devastated by hearing the horrific stories. The law students were also just overwhelmed and decided that this was an important forum for us to have. And so I know that we do have some bright young minds waiting to help. And this is a first step, perhaps, but I want to take this opportunity to salute the students who decided that we needed to do something. I also want to take this opportunity to, again, salute the actual participants. So special thanks to all of our speakers, Attorney Dalmacy, Attorney Fletcher, Attorney Lawless, and Attorney Torrez. These individuals spent a lot of time identifying information, and we want to thank you. Special thanks also to our technical team and communications staff. It's very difficult making sure that you synchronize everyone's watches. But again, special thanks to this student group and its executive board who made a decision to get this done. And also to the 10 Core Law Society that I am also affiliated with. At the end of the day, let me just repeat the 3 things that we are most interested in doing. Making sure that people are resilient, strategic, and knowledgeable. So on behalf of all of the participants, we just can't thank you enough. And I'm going to let my co-moderator close this out, if you would, Mr. Goss.
Just on behalf of the Cooley Real Property Probate and Trust Law Student Group, we really appreciate all of our participants. We thank the speakers for coming out and helping us distribute this information to the public. And we appreciate the public for coming here and allowing us to share some of this with you and be a part of this event. As a reminder, this event was recorded and it will be posted online, where we will share the link where you guys can view it indefinitely, anytime you may need.
And again, we will have two separate links, one for homeowners and one for tenants. Some of the information under homeowners, for those of you who anticipate being homeowners who are tenants, you might want to keep that on hand. But in any event, as we look forward to yet another storm season, please know that this information will hopefully help you. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day and stay safe.